Hello everyone and welcome back to a brand new list video, and in this one we're gonna talk about the 25 albums that disappointed me the most this year. This list is about albums in which I get into with a certain amount of expectations. It's from artists that I'm already familiar with their works, and there has been something in the past that has made me excited to look forward to anything else they've done. So getting into a certain album with a certain amount of hype and expectations and coming out of it not really getting what you wanted out of it might make for some disappointing results. So here are 25 albums in which I wanted a bit more out of them, to say the least. So at first, at number 25, we're gonna start with Nyx, the new album by Horna. The Finnish black metal group makes a comeback that basically offers all of the ideas that had managed to make Horna shine throughout the years. This is a pretty decent effort. It's just slightly disappointing in the sense that, considering that in 2020 they made one of my favorite black metal albums of the decade, I expected a bit more from it. It doesn't really have the same amount of intensity, the tracks are extremely lengthy without needing to, and the final almost 9-minute cut that is just dark folk did not really impress me that much. For the most part though, this is a solid effort with another set of banging riffs and tense black metal, just not as astonishing as other past works from them. Number 24 is Dance Band with the album Basic Editions. Now I didn't necessarily go into this with high expectations, and that's why it's so low in the list, because I had absolutely no idea what to expect out of this. The collaboration with John Wiz a few years back showed some strong potential as an experimental glitch noise album, and this solo work from Dance Band, mostly known as a member of No Age, is really all over the place. From IDM to glitch and ambient, this is quite an experimental and out there release that is quite interesting. But it's mostly just a bunch of ideas being thrown together in a really short album, with certain tracks not being all that great. There was the potential, but the execution left a lot to be desired in my opinion. Number 23 is Joy of Joys by Sit and Shine. Sit and Shine consistently remain one of the wildest experimental acts I've stumbled upon that keep making many different albums for years. When you get into a Sit and Shine album, it's mostly a surprise. You don't really know what to expect. Lots of times their experimentations and bold approaches to rock and electronic music work extremely well, but that's not really the case with Joy of Joys, a short 32-minute album with 15 tracks, lots of them being almost a minute long. Quite experimental and wacky, what to basically expect, but this time it didn't really work. Number 22 is Lil Texas with Need for Speed. Lil Texas has managed in a very short period of time to become one of the most prominent names in the hardstyle scene, embracing even more with the newest project the direction of raw style with unhinged kicks that are filled with distorted sustain rather than a booming attack. Lil Texas makes another album that as a whole does not manage in any way to keep you engaged in my opinion. While it doesn't overstay its welcome, and once again it does try to take influence from old school rave and drum and bass breaks and have some variety, the structures are predictable as well as how the samples are getting used. The production is once again really solid and loud, but the ideas are probably some of the most forgettable I can think of in a Lil Texas album. Number 21 is Childish Gambino with the soundtrack Band of Stone and the New World. The final album of Donald Glover as Childish Gambino is a soundtrack for his upcoming film of the same name. Interestingly enough, I get the feeling that this album got quickly forgotten, and I can sort of see why. Considering that this is the final Childish Gambino album, this is not what I expected. And on one hand, there are a few interesting experimentations with the first track and Got to Be, but a huge portion of this album is laid back R&B and pop rap songs. When the album doesn't try something bold and out there, it becomes boring. Even if we're talking about an album that is real over the place in terms of styles, influences and sound directions, the unfortunate thing is that many of those portions pass by unnoticed, and overall it's a long, bloated album with a couple strong moments and that's it. Number 20 is Yeet with Lifestyle. One of the biggest rappers on Rage definitely redeemed himself with 2093 that came out the same year and showed signs of versatility with its more experimental and industrial instrumentation. I was hoping that the new album Lifestyle would keep up with his style, but this is a massive step back to the standard formula of Rage with nothing distinct or out there, just a couple of highlights, but in its majority a bloated album that lacks originality. Hopefully 2093 is not just a fluke and he'll experiment more with sounds that will put him on the map above his contemporaries. Number 19 we have Ectasis, the new album of Xanias. Xanias is in my opinion a very talented artist and great singer, and especially with Lina Speras has made some gorgeous works. However, her approach on this new album on her solo project is really unfitting in my opinion. The ethereal wave alongside blunt trap beats that give a witch house aesthetic do not really work that much, and I really don't like the heavy vocal processing over here. It sounds artificial and lifeless, it gets tiring, and the sounds for the most part feel like they're coming from an amateur early 2010s witch house project. I really cannot see the appeal behind this massive change of sound and aesthetics unfortunately, but this was really mediocre. Next up it's the comeback album from Nero, Into the Unknown. It's been almost a decade that we got a new Nero album, so I obviously expected the results to be a bit better than what we got right here. On one hand, the drum and bass and dubstep elements that put them on the spot are still present in spare parts and sound sick. But for the most part, this is a run-of-the-mill EDM project stuck in early 2010s without any signs of development to the formula. So yeah, not really a strong comeback. At number 17 I'm gonna put the Charli XX remix album, Brat, and it's completely different but also still Brat. It's not always where you see a remix album getting talked about as much as Charli XCX's newest rendition of Prant, and on one hand I definitely get it considering the immaculate Girl So Confusing remix with Lorde, and others being teased and surpassing the originals such as Yes with Billie Eilish, and the one I was anticipating the most ever since the Boiler Room set, the 365 remix with Shygirl. But if you expect the rest of the album to be the same level of quality as the remixes I mentioned beforehand, you'll be disappointed. At least I was, considering some of the names over here. I expected more from their contribution, which I didn't get. Others such as So I and B2B were a massive letdown, and so the remix album for me was a hit or miss, with a tad bit more misses. Number 16 is gonna be Poppy with Negative Spaces. Poppy's new album is the closest we get to a fully realized alternative metal album. No weird transitions to pop, no wacky combinations, just certain tracks going into a more electronic direction, but not having the styles bleed together all at once. On one hand, I think it's for the better that we got a more balanced project that is not over the top by constantly going from one genre to the next, but for the most part this feels like a really generic alternative metal album. I'd say it's her best work vocally, but the quality of the songs is all over the place, and the interludes feel completely pointless. There are a few decent ideas, for the most part though this feels like one of my least favorite projects from her. Number 15 is gonna be Cellophane with Animal Mentality. Cellophane is a Greek dark wave and cold wave duo that has been in an upwards trajectory with their last releases, but I wasn't really feeling this new one. There's not something particularly different about it, and the fact that it's so samey is actually to its detriment. There's not something that bold about it, something that stands out. It's very average in its direction and execution, and while the more safe approach isn't necessarily a bad thing, the ideas over here are just not that memorable in my opinion. Number 14 is Caribou with Honey. Caribou is mostly known as an indie-tronic artist toying around with multiple other styles of electronic music. Having elements of house is not something unusual on Caribou's catalogue, but having a full-on house album, that's another thing. And the results are not that great in my opinion. Most of the tracks are just really mediocre, others I would say are actually kinda bad. The album becomes quickly one-dimensional with its vocals and the beats, and yeah, I wasn't feeling this one. The change of direction made for my least favorite Caribou album out of everything I've heard from him. At number 13 is gonna be A Dream We Had by Noisegirl. Having this comeback from a Japanese artist that made one of the most exceptional power noise albums of the 2000s is not something that I expected. It began last year with a pretty interesting EP, and now we get a whole new album, which I don't think it really showcases what has made some of his past works quite special. For the most part, this feels like a standard harsh noise album with a couple of rhythmic parts, which are the best element of the album, but the harsh noise segments can be overbearing and sound pretty much the same, not really what I was expecting. At number 12 is Class Ring by Prant. Prant was on a roll in 2024 and made tons of different releases. Out of all of them, the 2.5-hour Class Ring felt the most unnecessary, depicting the two Columbine shooters on the cover and in reference to the Doom mod the shooters created, with a map being the entire school layout where the shootings happened. This edgy album contains titles that are just different sections of the school comprised of long-winded and unengaging 10 to 15 minute ambient and drone tracks. While it does feel similar with one of his most well-known works, Rainbow Mirror, we've seen results like this work in such a better fashion in the past. I guess it sets the mood as background music if you're playing through a disturbing Doom mod, but other than that, this album in particular feels like a waste of time. Number 11 is It Beckons Our Soul by Dark Throne. For a moment I even forgot that the Dark Throne album was released this year. Out of this new era with heavy and doom metal directions, I believe we got some of their best works, but at this point it's just more of the same. The solid riffs are still there, but I really can't get behind some of these production choices. It sounds way too flat and these vocals can be abhorrent at times. The way they are mixed, the use of effects or lack thereof, this album just passed by and it's my least favorite out of their newest stuff. And now getting into the top 10, we start with Scope Neglect by Ben Frost. To be fair, I don't think I've heard anything else remotely similar to this. This is a bizarre, glitchy, heavily mechanical metal album with ambient synth passages. It's really wacky, out there and heavily experimental, but that doesn't mean that I like what I'm listening to. Very chaotic and all over the place, the mixing needs a bit more punch with some of the guitar parts that are kinda buried, and the whole thing just becomes quickly one-dimensional. Once you get the tone of the album and what it's going for, it doesn't really develop beyond that point, it's more of the same. Very wild idea with the use of instrumentation, and I don't really know if there's any way to make something like this work, but this is certainly not it. Number 9 is Fred Again with 10 Days. After a very promising direction with a more pumped up and energetic USP, 10 Days is his most laid-back house album and also in my opinion his most blunt collection of songs. 20 tracks with half of them being a couple second skits that lead to the main ideas and feel completely pointless. So in retrospect it's 10 tracks and most of them are pretty mediocre and most of the features bring nothing interesting to the table. Not the type of electronic release I was expecting from Fred Again at this point in his career. It sucks that I have to put this, but at number 8 it's Halsey with The Great Impersonator. Halsey had a stunning development as an artist with her previous album If I Can't Have Love, I Want Power, teaming up with 9 Inch Nails on the production front and making a really bold and interesting album that I wasn't expecting. And so I was looking forward to what Halsey was about to do next, and The Great Impersonator looked really promising. From the marketing cycle with the multiple photos impersonating legendary artists that have influenced her over the years, as well as the musical direction of this album, what I like about The Great Impersonator is that it's a really solid concept album, her most vulnerable work after fighting with cancer and loss, and it's undoubtedly her most mature work yet. But I'm not really into the music. For the most part, it's just acoustic ballads and singer-songwriter stuff that I don't really care for. There are some interesting alt-rock directions, but as a whole, 18 tracks and 66 minutes, it's a bit too much. Still better than the mediocre stuff she did when she started, but I was really hoping I could like The Great Impersonator more than I did. Number 7, it's Kendrick Lamar with GNX. I find it very interesting that an artist on his caliber dropped an entire album out of nowhere. But then again, this feels more of like a collection of decent ideas rather than a fully crafted hip-hop album that would stand the test of time as much as his more classic works. Now don't get me wrong, this is still better than a huge portion of rap albums to come out this year, even if I consider this to be one of Kendrick's weakest. It's certainly one of his more straightforward albums that embraces a more standard rap approach. Many of the tracks feel like they follow up the direction of Not Like Us, which I can see it as it's a really catchy and energetic song, but for many of those cuts, this approach doesn't really do all that much for me in the long run. The album is decent, but from Kendrick Lamar, I'm expecting something more than just decent. At number 6 is gonna be Zillion Ardor with the album Grave. It's not like I necessarily got into this with high expectations, but considering the way they started, it's sad to witness this constant downwards trajectory. The weird blends of black metal with spirituals have been almost completely abandoned right here, and all we get is a mellow, run-of-the-mill alternative metal album with nothing special about it. It doesn't feel like the same band anymore, and it's not like we're talking about a bold change of direction. It's such a generic take on alternative metal, where it's only when we get the return to form on a few glimpses where the album shows any signs of interest, like with the song Hide in Shade for example. Other than that, stick to their old stuff and don't even bother with whatever this is. At number 5 is gonna be 21 Pilots with the album Clancy. The old pop duo showed some massive signs of development and maturity with the release of their conceptual album Trends, one of my personal favorites out of the past decade. And while it's one thing to be disappointed with the direction of Scaled and Dicey, considering that Clancy was the follow-up of Trends, I certainly was expecting much more out of it. But what we get is a really consistent album in terms of quality that starts really strong with Overcompensate, and then it's all over the place without really having lots of the elements that made Trends such a special release. It's actually kinda crazy how little I remember out of this album, considering that this was supposed to be a Trends follow-up, but outside the solid production, the instrumentation, especially on the electronic side, and the vocals are not really doing it for me. At number 4 is Jpegmafia with I Laid Down My Life For You. I'm in a weird position when it comes to Jpegmafia works, because I do find him one of the most talented and wackiest hip-hop producers in recent memory, but there are times where I just can't really get into whatever type of mess he's making. With his Danny Brown collaboration, which saw some extremely imaginative and creative beats done by JPEG, and some impeccable sampling work. So after hearing the hose, I was hoping that this would be another step in the right direction. But despite some change-ups with a bit more emphasis on rock and metal elements, for the most part the tracks over here feel like a bunch of ideas being thrown together and see what sticks. Some tracks are pretty short, others go for way too long, and especially the track It's Dark and Hell Is Hot, that DJ Rameme sampling is very lazy work. Once again, I wasn't particularly impressed with the new Jpegmafia album and couldn't really see the hype behind it. Number 3 is this collaboration of James Blake and Lil Yachty, Bad Cameo. After Let's Start Here showed Lil Yachty's successful venture into the sounds of psychedelic rock and soul, this collaboration with James Blake is another curveball that could lead to some fascinating results in my opinion, but for the most part this feels like a James Blake album that happens to have Lil Yachty on vocals who don't really feel all that appropriate. With the dreamy and psychedelic direction of Bad Cameo, they're kinda distracting. And I've been someone who has been really forgiving with many albums from Lil Yachty, and I still find this contribution right here to make for his weakest work he's been into. The album sounds extremely bland, and even in terms of James Blake works, it's not all that engaging. Could have been something much greater, but it's more of like an album that maybe didn't need to exist, at least in that state. Number 2 is gonna be Little Big with Lobster Popstar. In the past couple of years, Little Big have lost their edge, and they've gone from an outlandish hard bass and hard house project with insane visuals to a tongue-in-cheek, bland electropop style with juvenile and immature performances and way less eccentric visualizations. Having this downgrade of their latest singles on a full album results in an obnoxious work whose only saving grace comes from moments that are an ode to the past, such as the more serious and dynamic Refugee. But do you need to sit through 11 bland and uninspiring electropop tracks to reach that point? Not really. The Russian group made some bangers in the past, but that energy is being replaced with lazy and obnoxious choruses that all sound the same. And at number 1, it's gonna be Vultures 2 by Kanye West and $. The thing with Vultures 2 is that I still probably don't consider this as much of a god-awful album as most people do. But this is undoubtedly Kanye West's most effortless album. Lyrically, once again, the album is bad. $. Brings nothing to the table and Kanye West is a garbage human. And his appalling beliefs reflect on the songs he creates, so it's not like you can simply let them slide when it comes to him creating art. Musically, this is really rough, and this comes from someone who finds his roughness being part of the appeal in albums such as the first Vultures, which I consider to be kinda decent, and even Donda 2 to a certain extent. And I don't mind how Vultures 2 sounds at times, but the ideas are not that much there. It's clearly been thrown together, and there could have been more to this so it won't sound this half-baked. At this point, I'm not shocked at Kanye West as a person. He's bottom of the barrel piece of shit, but even his music has gone to a downward spiral. Vultures 2 is his worst album. And this is gonna do it for me with the albums I was the most disappointed with out of 2024. What were the albums that disappointed you the most this year? Let me know down in the comments. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video, subscribe for more content like this. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Goodbye.